unsubstantiated report that Trump had been shown documents by U.S. intelligence officials showing Russia had compromising information about him. Senior national correspondent John Roberts is outside Trump Tower tonight with the latest. Good evening, John.
Brett, good evening to you. In breaking news, a senior source inside the transition tells Fox News tonight that contrary to reports, the intelligence chiefs never handed Donald Trump a written summary of these unsubstantiated allegations that Russia was compiling information on Trump with which to blackmail him. It was allegedly given to him on Friday when he was briefed on Russian cyber spying. At his press conference today, Trump was on the warpath about those reports. To Donald Trump, it was merely another attempt by opponents to diminish his presidency. The release of a dossier of damaging, in some cases salacious allegations that were completely unverified.
Disgraceful that the intelligence agencies allowed any information that turned out to be so false and fake. And that's something that Nazi Germany would have done and did do.
The allegations had been quietly circulating for months among politicos and reporters. A senior transition source tells Fox News it was, quote, barely mentioned in passing by the intel chiefs on Friday, and that Trump saw the substance of the allegations later.
It's all fake news. It's phony stuff. It didn't happen. And it was gotten by opponents of ours, as you know, because you reported it, and so did many of the other people. It was a group of opponents that got together, sick people.
As Trump's team was searching for a way to battle back after its release, Trump was thrown a lifeline by Vladimir Putin, whose spokesman said the Kremlin never collected compromising information on Trump, calling the document an utter fabrication and nonsense.
President Putin and Russia put out a statement today that this fake news was indeed fake news. They said it totally never happened. Now, somebody would say, oh, of course he's going to say that. I respected the fact that he said that.
But Trump's praise for Putin had its limits in response to a question from Fox News acknowledging for the first time that Putin did in fact likely order the hack of the DNC.
As far as hacking, I think it was Russia.
And Trump pledged when he becomes president, the relationship with Putin will be very different.
He shouldn't be doing it. He won't be doing it. Russia will have much greater respect for our country when I'm leading it than when other people have led it. But I won't be given a little reset button like Hillary. Here, press this piece of plastic.
All the talk about Russia was a diversion from the original intent of the press conference to detail how Trump will unwind himself from his vast business empire. Trump's attorney, Sherry Dillon, announced he would place all of his assets into a trust, but not a blind trust, because that just wouldn't work.
President Trump can't unknow he owns Trump Tower. And the press will make sure that any new developments at the Trump Organization are well publicized.
Trump will also resign all his offices and turn control of the company over to sons Eric and Don Jr. and associate Alan Weisselberg. The Trump Organization will not have to sell the old post office hotel in Washington, despite a clause in the federal lease saying no elected official may hold an ownership stake in the project. The company argues Mr. Trump is exempt from the clause because he signed the lease before he ran for president. And Mr. Trump today promised that all profits derived from payments from foreign governments to Trump Organization companies would be donated to the U.S. Treasury. Trump also weighed in on Obamacare, revealing it's his preference to tackle it all at once.
It'll be repeal and replace. Will most likely be on the same day or the same week, but probably the same day. Could be the same hour.
Trump also said that he would wait until the Monday after the inauguration to start signing many of the executive orders that he plans to issue to undo a lot of what President Obama did in his last 4 years. He says he's going to wait till Monday because the weekend is taken up with inaugural festivities. He also said that he would appoint a justice, or at least nominate a justice, to fill the vacancy left by the death of Antonin Scalia within 2 weeks after taking office. Brett?
John Roberts live outside Trump Tower. John, thank you. President-elect Trump has named his pick for Veterans Affairs Secretary. He is David Shulkin, the VA's current top health official. Shulkin has worked in hospital management for more than 2 decades. He has expressed support for closer VA ties with the private sector, but still opposes full privatization. Let's look at the Russia story now from the intelligence side of the coin. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is in Washington tonight with that part of the story. Good evening, Catherine.
But the dossier was known to senior intelligence officials, and the FBI was working to confirm or discredit the claims. Last night, CNN was first on the air, and BuzzFeed went further, posting the document from a former British spy who was paid by Republicans and Democrats for opposition research. Quote, "We have always erred on the side of publishing," BuzzFeed said. As we noted in our story, there is serious reason to doubt the allegations. Publishing this document was not an easy or simple call, and people of goodwill may disagree with our choice. After the Trump news conference, CNN released its own statement. "Our decision to publish carefully sourced reporting about the operations of our government is vastly different than BuzzFeed's decision to publish unsubstantiated memos. The Trump team knows this. I cannot confirm or deny whether these media reports are the subject of investigation by intelligence agencies," a senior Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee said. "I do believe that the House and Senate Intelligence Committees should lead a completely nonpartisan investigation into the entire spectrum of Russian covert influence activities in the United States and abroad." Writing on Twitter, Hillary Clinton's former campaign manager accused the FBI director of a double standard. James Comey was given information about Trump exchanges with Russia last year, but no letter to Congress and the voters. Stunning. Mr. Trump said today he concluded after a recent briefing that the leaks have come from the intelligence community.
And what happened is I had my meeting. Nobody knew, not even Rona, my executive assistant for years. She didn't know. I didn't tell her. Nobody knew. The meeting was had, the meeting was over, they left, and immediately the word got out that I had a meeting.
There was no response from the head of the intelligence community this evening. Separately, the episode was described to Fox News as unfortunate because in private, the relationship between Mr. Trump and the intelligence community leadership is respectful, even good, Brett.
Catherine, thank you. So what do you think? Do you think the Russia story will hurt President-elect Trump in any way? And what was your take on the news conference? Let me know on Twitter at Brett Baier. You can use the hashtag Special Report, or on Facebook at facebook.com/BrettBaierSR. Let's get some perspective tonight on the President-elect's news conference today. Senior political analyst Britt Hume is with us tonight in Boca Grande, Florida, just a little southwest of here. Good evening, Britt. Your take.
I'm Brett. Well, I think it was an interesting news conference, and as you say, it was packed with news. What I sense may happen here is that people will be mesmerized by the force of his attack on the news media that published information about these scurrilous rumors that apparently were circulating during the campaign that nobody thought were worthy of publication until, just yesterday by one news outlet. Referenced by other news outlets, but it may distract attention from some of the things he did today. He did take steps to try to eliminate conflicts of interest, as John Roberts explained, and in doing so, I think he won't satisfy everybody, but I think, Brett, we can infer from the reaction of the Trump supporters to his refusal to release the tax returns that his base, at least, doesn't care about this stuff, and that as far as they're going to be concerned, he'll be fine with that. And the other thing is, and the other thing, Brett, is that he was pretty firm on Russia in ways we hadn't heard before. His acknowledgement that John pointed out that Putin's Russia was behind the hacking of the Democratic Party emails was a first, basically. And we sense from that, I think, Brett, that it meant that the intelligence briefing he got on that subject, he took seriously and I think was probably impressed by.
Here's a little more from the president-elect on the relationship with Russia.
We have a horrible relationship with Russia. Russia can help us fight ISIS. If Putin likes Donald Trump, guess what, folks? That's called an asset, not a liability. Now, I don't know that I'm going to get along with Vladimir Putin. I hope I do, but there's a good chance I won't. And if I don't, do you honestly believe that Hillary would be tougher on Putin than me? Does anybody in this room really believe that? Give me a break.
Brett, what do you think about the tone, the tenor, the delivery, what we can learn from today that may forecast into his time in the White House and interaction with the press?
Well, I think this, Brett, that it's pretty clear that he regards his potential relationship with Vladimir Putin as very much a work in progress. And what he seemed to be telling us there was that it remains to be seen whether he'll have a chummy relationship with Vladimir Putin. And that attitude was very much reflected in the testimony on Capitol Hill today from his nominee to be Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who expressed very similar sentiments and was very dubious that Russia is any kind of a friend of the United States. So I think you put those two things together, together, and a lot of the hand-wringing that's been going on about what a great pal Trump is going to try to be of Putin's, I think is badly misplaced.
And his supporters on social media seem pretty fired up with the way he dealt with that news conference.
Well, they respond to that kind of thing. When he takes on the news media, they like that. The question I would have about that, Brett, is this. This story that website BuzzFeed published yesterday was the subject of widespread condemnation within the news media itself. And its details, the lurid details of things that are almost certainly false, were not picked up widely at all. So what is the effect of Mr. Trump, who had important information to communicate today? The information about what he's going to try to do to avoid conflicts of interest was one thing. The comments he made about the relationship with Russia was another. The announcement of his VA secretary was yet another. That these things were important business to conduct today. So he sends his press secretary out at the very beginning, before he said a word, to denounce the news media on this thing. Then the vice president, who spoke next, mentioned it, and then the president-elect himself mentioned it, thereby calling attention to a matter that I think wasn't going very far and wasn't going to receive wide circulation and would have been forgotten in a matter of days. Now, it may still be, but it does raise an interesting question of whether when you go out after something like that, whether you simply end up feeding the story. We'll see.
Yeah, we will see. Brett, as always, thank you.
Thank you, Brett.
We believe the U.S. Senate, as you look live, will begin shortly a series of votes on the budget that will clear the way for them to pass legislation launching the repeal and replace process for Obamacare we've been talking about for the past few days. It is being termed a vote-a-rama in the U.S. Senate. We're told it will start momentarily. We're monitoring the floor there. There are more than 100 amendments in play. In the end, Senate Republicans hope to be able to avoid Democratic filibusters and send a bill to the House for a Friday vote. We'll get a live report from Mike Emanuel at the Capitol in the next hour. The president-elect's pick to be the country's top diplomat was very diplomatic today, under occasionally aggressive questioning during his confirmation hearing. And some of that questioning came from his own party. Much of that focused on Rex Tillerson's business and personal relationships with Russia. Correspondent Rich Edson has the story.
It was a Republican senator who asked the most piercing questions of the Republican president-elect's Secretary of State nominee.
Is Vladimir Putin a war criminal?
I would not use that term.
Well, let me describe the situation in Aleppo, and perhaps that will help you reach that conclusion.
It is his relationship with Russia. Its president attracted the most criticism to former ExxonMobil cease-abandoned business with Russia. Rubio seized on that relationship to probe Tillerson's belief on Russia under President Vladimir Putin.
You are still not prepared to say that Vladimir Putin and his military have violated the rules of war and have conducted war crimes in Aleppo.
Now, those are very, very serious charges to make.
Mr. Tillerson, do you believe that Vladimir Putin and his cronies are responsible?
I do not have sufficient information to make that claim.
Tillerson says the U.S. and Russia are unlikely to be friends because of their different value systems. He calls Russia's invasion of Crimea illegal, demanding a stronger response from Ukraine with U.S.
military response in defensive posture, not an offensive posture.
Tillerson also drew criticism from Democrats in Rubio by opposing mandatory sanctions against Russia for interfering in the U.S. election. Tillerson says he instead supports granting the incoming administration the authority to increase sanctions at its discretion. The Senate's top Democrat says Tillerson's response is tantamount to sweeping Russia's flouting of international norms under the rug. Democrats also question whether Tillerson will ever stop serving the company he worked for more than 40 years.
So I ask you, sir, if you would be willing to recuse yourself from any manner dealing with ExxonMobil's economic interests.
Any matter that might involve ExxonMobil or has the appearance that it could lead to some type of conflict, I will seek the guidance of the Ethics Council.
This hearing ended just 2 minutes ago. Before it concluded, they eventually moved beyond Exxon and Russia. Tillerson says he does not see climate change as an imminent national security threat. He says he opposes fully lifting the embargo against Cuba and says the United States needs to be more aggressive to confront China in the South China Sea. Brett?
Rich Edson live on the Hill outside the committee room. Rich, thank you. So how did Rex Tillerson perform today? Syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer joins us tonight from Washington with his reaction. Charles, your take.
I thought he did very well. I mean, there were moments that were somewhat uncomfortable, like the one you showed with Rubio, Assad, and war crimes. But the theme of what Tillerson was saying is, I'm not really into making gestures or pronouncements. We saw what he said about Ukraine. His critique of Obama was not that he was insufficiently demonstrative, but that he didn't give defensive weapons or intelligence to actually help the Ukrainians to defend themselves. That's a pretty hard-headed approach. So even though he wouldn't accede to demands that he go around denouncing Putin and Assad for war crimes, he seemed to be saying, we're going to be tough. As for the sanctions imposed for the interference with our elections, I think he's right. They're puny, they're insignificant. He won't repeal them, but he leaves it an open question as to whether, once they decide how to act, how Putin reacts to the new administration, they can increase them or abolish them, which seems to me to be a fairly reasonable position.
Opportune that we're talking about this, analyzing this hearing, as just seconds ago, the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer put out a statement in part saying this: Rex Tillerson's testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee today was incredibly troubling. First, on the day when even President-elect Trump admitted Russia was actively working to undermine our elections, the nominee for Secretary of State couldn't even bring himself to state that he supported the existing sanctions. I want to play a little bit more of that Rubio exchange with Tillerson and get you to react.
You mentioned in your statement about the invasion by Russia of Crimea. Does Russia have in your view, a legal claim to Crimea?
No, sir. That was a taking of territory that was not theirs. In that instance, I would have done something different.
Military force.
A show of force at the border of the country that had been already had territory taken from it.
American military force in this case?
No, I indicated Ukrainian military force supported by the U.S. providing them with capable defensive weapons.
It obviously wasn't the Rubio exchange, but he had a number of exchanges today. Charles, I mean, is there anything that you see potentially here that trips up the President-elect's State Department nominee?
I really don't think so. The Schumer attack is what you'd expect from Democrats, who were really rather quiet when Obama didn't lift a finger, basically when Crimea was absorbed by Russia. So I wouldn't take that seriously. The real question is whether the troika of McCain and Lindsey Graham and Rubio, the three sort of hardliners in the Senate, if you lose those three, you could lose the nominee. Whether they might go against Tillerson, I think not.
Charles Krauthammer, live in D.C. Charles, thank you. This was day 2 of the confirmation hearing for the President-elect's pick as Attorney General. Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions was confronted in an unprecedented instance by Senate colleague, New Jersey Democrat Cory Booker.
His record indicates that we cannot count on him to support state and national efforts towards bringing justice to the justice system, and people on both sides of the aisle who readily admit that the justice system as it stands now is biased against the poor, against drug addicted, against mentally ill, and against people of color.
Experts said Sessions did very well in day one and day two. We'll see. We'll have a report live from Capitol Hill in our next hour. Up next, what did you think of President Obama's farewell address, and what is next for the outgoing president? First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 45 in Baltimore, where the mayor's office says the city and the U.S. Department of Justice have reached an agreement on a consent decree requiring that city to reform its police department. The negotiations are said to be done, but the deal has not yet been signed with Baltimore. Fox 10 in Phoenix, where a government watchdog group says veterans are still dying while waiting for medical treatment at the Phoenix VA hospital. Vets reportedly are still facing excessive wait times there. More than a dozen veterans have reportedly been harmed or died because of the delays. And this is a live look at San Francisco from our affiliate Fox 2. The big story there tonight, the weather. A tornado touched down south of Sacramento late yesterday. Heavy rains have caused widespread flooding and prompted evacuations. Emergency crews have been called on to rescue trapped residents in that area. The back-to-back storms have brought the heaviest rain in a decade to parts of Northern California and Nevada. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We are outside the Beltway, too, in Daytona Beach. We'll be right back. 6 top employees at Volkswagen have been indicted by a grand jury over that company's emissions cheating scandal. VW has also agreed to pay a record $4.3 billion penalty. That is the largest ever levied by the government against an automaker. VW installed software into diesel engines, allowing them to turn on pollution controls during testing and then turn them off during real-world driving. On the markets today, stocks were up. The Dow gained 99. The S&P 500 finished ahead 6. The Nasdaq picked up 12 for another record close. President Obama is back at the White House tonight after last night's farewell address to the nation from Chicago. It was, as expected, part pep rally, part warning, part defense of his presidency. Correspondent Kevin Cork takes a look.
What a difference 8 years make.
We, in fact, all share the same proud type, citizen.
President Obama's farewell address took place last night a little over a mile away from Grant Park, where he gave his first speech after being elected. But his remarks diverged dramatically. Gone were the promises of hope and change, replaced by concern over growing threats to our democracy. The president warned that left unchecked, rising income inequality, growing racial tensions, the fear of terrorism, and an increasingly fractured media could gradually erode our democratic institutions.
Our democracy is threatened whenever we take it for granted.
And that includes taking for granted that race relations will continue to improve.
I've lived long enough to know that race relations are better than they were 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, no matter what some folks say.
While that may or may not be true, a recent ABC News Washington Post poll found that 63% of Americans surveyed thought race relations were generally bad. That's up from just 22% in 2009, the president's first year in office. The president reserves some of his harshest criticism for social media, calling it one element fueling the great sorting of America.
We become so secure in our bubbles that we start accepting only information, whether it's true or not, that fits our opinions.
That comment was perceived by some to be a thinly veiled reference to President-elect Donald Trump, whose embrace of social media has been the subject of much consternation among political and media elites.
Without a willingness to admit new information and that science and reason matter, then we're going to keep talking past each other.
House Speaker Paul Ryan said, sincere in his belief as he was, President Obama has steered our country in the wrong direction. And here's the good news. Things are about to change. Indeed they are. Also last night, Brett, the president called on all Americans, regardless of political affiliation or interest, to help restore the sense of common purpose that's so badly needed right now in the country. A call that has gone largely unanswered over the past 8 years. Brett?
Kevin Cork live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thank you. Let's get some analysis now of the president's speech last night. John Avlon is editor-in-chief for the Daily Beast and the author of the new book, Washington's Farewell, the Founding Fathers' Warning to Future Generations. He joins us tonight from New York. John, thanks for being here. I want to get your take on the speech, first of all, overall, broadly.
It was a fascinating speech. It was definitely a rally for the faithful, but it was also a rejection of fear. And as you saw, he clearly laid out threats to our democracy, continuing that tradition of warnings in presidential farewell addresses that you're so familiar with. Warning about the role of media, the hyper-partisanship, polarization, as well as global forces, whether it be, radical Islamic terrorism or the rise of a liberal democracy and some of those temptations. So a lot of storm clouds on the horizon, but President Obama trying to put an optimistic face on the country and a fundamental belief in inclusion, a fundamental belief that our independence is best guaranteed by our interdependence.
The unity message, he did reference and harken back to basically what you wrote about, Washington's farewell address, the first farewell address. Take a listen to this.
In his own farewell address, George Washington wrote that self-government is the underpinning of our safety, prosperity, and liberty. But from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth, that we should reject the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties that make us one.
You talk about unity, John. I think there were some, especially Trump supporters, who thought there were not so veiled messages directly to the president-elect and his incoming administration.
Well, there are deep differences, and a lot of the change that seems to be coming away is counter to President Obama's political beliefs. But he took great care to root his, I think, progressive profession of faith in the founding fathers and fundamental American values. And that quote from George Washington was an interesting one. Washington was warning about the forces he felt could destroy our democratic republic: hyperpartisanship, excessive debt, and foreign wars. And what that quote in particular references is those folks who come in and try to divide us as Americans, whether it be political reasons or pushing a foreign agenda, that those are the people, even if they wrap themselves up in the American flag, those are the folks to watch out for, because they're never actually working in America's greatest interests. They're trying to divide rather than unite us as Americans.
There was a pep rally, though, John. There was something about reviving his own party, wasn't there? I mean, what role do you think President Obama, after he leaves January 20th, will play in the Democratic Party?
Well, it's, I think, going to be very different than a typical post-presidency. One, the Democrats don't have a deep bench, and Barack Obama's approval ratings have been going up over the last year of his presidency, something somewhat unusual. And I think de facto he will still be the head of the Democratic Party. But to remain sort of his authority as an ex-president, he's got to remain at least somewhat above politics. That's a difficult line to walk. Eisenhower, you wrote that great book about, went to his farm at Gettysburg. Washington went to Mount Vernon. Well, Barack Obama's going to stay in Chicago till his daughter, stay in Washington until his daughter finishes high school, and then move to Chicago. But there's no one who's got his star power on the Democratic stage. So he's going to be called on to unite that very disparate party right now.
John, thank you. Again, the book, Washington's Farewell. Congratulations, and thanks for being here.
Congrats to your book as well. It's great.
Thanks, John. Why doesn't the U.S. have a detailed plan to fight in cyberspace? The latest from the Pentagon on that issue when we come back.
Eisenhower shaped our nation in ways few knew. Now, with exclusive interviews and never-before-seen footage, we go inside the final days in office and the final mission of an American giant. Watch as Brett Baer anchors 3 days in January, Sunday.
Eisenhower said in his first inaugural address. One of the most disturbing things to come out of recent statements from American military and intelligence officials is the lack of a basic plan to deal with cyber threats. More on this now from National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin at the Pentagon tonight. Good evening, Jennifer.
Good evening, Brett. President-elect Donald Trump has given his national security team 90 days to come up with a plan to defend the nation's infrastructure and secrets from hacking.
We're hacked by everybody. The United States, our government, out of a list of 17 in terms of industries, is the worst. It's number 17 in terms of protection.
In my view, based on what I've been able to read and have been briefed, we do not have a cybersecurity policy. We do not have a comprehensive strategy around how to deal with what has been a rapidly emerging threat.
Trump acknowledged today that he believed Russia was behind the hacking of the DNC. It was the first time he has said so publicly. But he also pointed out other nations have penetrated U.S. systems, blaming China, which is accused of stealing the sensitive security records of 22 million Americans. That cyber attack occurred in 2014, one of the most damaging government heists in U.S. history, according to U.S. officials. Later that year, the State Department had to take down its entire unclassified email system due to foreign hacking. In 2015, a cyber hack into the office of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs affected more than 4,000 unclassified email accounts at the Pentagon. Those accounts were kept offline for 10 days. In other words, foreign hacking is not new.
When were you made aware that the Russians were hacking into the U.S. election, and should the U.S. have responded to that?
But I think a definitive conclusion was drawn in October.
U.S. officials admit that the U.S. government does not currently have a well-articulated cyber defense strategy.
Well, we've tried to up our game defensively. We have, selectively responded. The Sony picture attack comes to mind.
The American people are getting a picture of how big this is, how ubiquitous it is, how dangerous it is, and that something has to be done about it.
Years ago, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta warned about a future cyber Pearl Harbor. Brett.
Jennifer Griffin live at the Pentagon. Jennifer, thank you. Let's talk more about cyber threats. Sam Palmisano is former president and CEO of IBM, and he's currently vice chair of the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. He joins us from New York. Sam, thanks for being here. We had you on the set in Washington about the commission and the report, and I want to get your thoughts. After that, we had the national intelligence folks up on the Hill answering questions, and they seemed to not say they had a plan in place. It seems like it's been a long time to come up with this cyber attack plan.
Well, Brett, as you know, I've spent a year going through and studying all elements of this. Our focus really was not on national security by the direction of the executive order, but more on the commercial economic side. But having been through all the work that was done, we had multiple hearings. I agree. There's no comprehensive end-to-end plan. And it's a combination of policy, it's a combination of technology, it's a combination of research and development. And as Rex said, it's also a combination of international relations, trade agreements, acts of war, et cetera, et cetera. So if you stand back from it, and I spent a year now looking at this, there really isn't an end-to-end plan, which we came up with some recommendations, but we were only focused on the commercial side of things, not the national security side of things.
So after looking at it as in-depthly as closely as you did, where would you rate where the U.S. is as far as its ability to deal with this issue broadly?
My opinion, and I spent a lot of time on the national security side when I was working with the Cyber Command Center, as well as other work I did with the Council of Foreign Relations. We're really good technically within that establishment. It doesn't mean things aren't going to happen, but if you had to rank the things in the U.S. as far as our ability to deal with cyber to protect our society and our economy, quite honestly, national security, the intelligence agencies, and the military are the best that we have within government. From there, it goes downhill very, very quickly. The commercial side of government, the OPM hack, those sorts of things. There's a significant amount of work that needs to be done to clean up the infrastructure of the support systems of the U.S. government. We also need a lot to do to enhance the Internet for the citizens, and that's authentication, identification management, access points, and the like. But all that needs to be done. That's when I talk about a comprehensive report. Like a lot of things in large organizations, it's very fragmented, and no one has stood back. I mean, the president has never asked for a strategy. And it's not just the past administration. We could go back. We went back to the Clinton administration. No one has asked for, give me a strategy to deal with this problem that's end-to-end, that touches all elements of our society, not only national security or not only the commercial economic interests or not only the banking system, an end-to-end strategy. And, oh, by the way, when you do that, we need to have somebody in charge. And we have no one in charge.
So are you encouraged by what you hear from President-elect Donald Trump about his plans, his administration's plans to deal with this?
Well, I think, quite honestly, in light of all the attention it's getting now because of the Russian hack in the election, or the process of DNC, et cetera, I think now we have a heightened awareness. But somebody needs to do something, Brad. I mean, I've been on this subject for almost 10 years. Someone needs to take an action. By that I mean, I would suggest, and we say in the report, the president should appoint somebody who's in charge of a cyber strategy, that if something occurs, they can convene the meeting with the appropriate people. Someone needs to be put in charge. It is that simple. Now, then a lot of work has to occur, but I would start with putting somebody in charge. And there is no one, as of today, in charge.
We talked last time you were with me about how extensive this is. It also includes the Internet of Things, anything essentially connected to the Internet. And there are some amazing stories out there, Sam, about what hackers are getting access to and what they're seeing and what they're doing.
You're absolutely correct. And you had a speaker on a couple of nights ago that talked about the Internet of Things. All these devices today, even the home devices, are connected to the Internet. And basically, we call them access points. They're points of entry, whether it's a camera, a sensor, a Siri, whatever that it happens to be, Alexa, etc. And the challenge associated with it is, first of all, those devices need to become more secure. We recommend they put, I'll call it the cyber star, like the energy efficiency star of the past, that when you buy one of these devices, you get a rating on its security in that device itself. So you rate the devices. Secondarily, another thing, we need to educate people. I mean, if you're a high-profile person, if you have Alexis or something in your home, you need to understand that as you interface with that device, it's building a pattern of your behavior in the cloud. So it's creating your profile. Now, for somebody like me, it's retired, nobody's going to care. But somebody like you or somebody who's in a high position, either in the private sector or the public sector, they need to understand. I'll make the analogy. I mean, people used to say, well, I deleted my email. Well, delete never stood for erase until all these embarrassing situations occurred when people realized they really didn't get rid of their email, they just deleted it. Well, it's the same thing today. As you use these devices, there's a profile being built. My point is they're terrific devices, and they're wonderful for personal convenience, but the user needs to be educated to the associated implications as they interface with these kinds of technologies.
Yeah. Sam, it is scary stuff, and we really appreciate you coming on, and we'll follow this issue because it's obviously big for the country. I may go to carrier pigeons. I'm not sure, just to be safe. Sam, thank you so much.
Sure thing. Thank you so much.
All right. Next up, President-elect Donald Trump takes on the media over Russia. He says he'll either get along with Vladimir Putin or he won't, and it gets fiery at times. We'll get reaction from the panel when we come back.
I have no dealings with Russia. I have no deals in Russia. I have no deals that could happen in Russia because we've stayed away. And I have no loans with Russia. We could make deals in Russia very easily if we wanted to. I just don't want to because I think that would be a conflict.
Donald Trump, president-elect, his first news conference since July, and it got fiery at times, heated with the media for reports, unsubstantiated, that Russia had some details, personal information, financial information on him, that he pushed back hard on. He also went into a number of different topics about the wall in Mexico, his financial ties with his business. Let's break down this news conference with our panel from Washington. Matt Schlapp is contributor with The Hill. Susan Page, Washington bureau chief at USA Today, and Fox News chief Washington correspondent James Rosen. All right, James, first an overview about this news conference and your assessment.
Well, aside from the sort of hand-to-hand combat with selected members of the news media whom Mr. Trump deemed especially dishonest or irresponsible in their reporting, there was a lot of news. We learned, for example, that the repeal and replace for Obamacare will happen, as Mr. Trump said, essentially simultaneously. We learned that we're expecting a major report on our hacking defenses within 90 days and that we should get a Supreme Court nominee within the first 2 weeks of the Trump presidency. So there was a lot to it substantively, quite apart from the sort of raucous flavor of the thing, I think in all, it made good on his promise that he made when he visited that carrier plant in Indiana in November, and he said, if it's not presidential, that's okay. That's okay. And I think he's going to redefine what it means for us to have a presidential news conference.
Now, I didn't invite you on here for the impression, but that's added bonus. Susan, the pushback from the president-elect, from the transition team, could not have been stronger to these reports.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of criticism today by journalists of the decision by BuzzFeed to publish a salacious, unsubstantiated version of that report. Less so for CNN, though, I think, because they were with their report. But in any case, his pushback on that could not have been fiercer, I think. He used a four-letter word in describing it. He said it was outrageous and unethical, and when the CNN reporter, Jim Acosta, tried to ask a question, he wouldn't let him ask a question because criticizing his organization. So, you know, this was a situation I think was pretty perilous for any politician to have had a story like that come out, to be dealing with it in a few hours, and he dealt with it with some real confidence and certainty. It doesn't mean that story's going away, but I thought he was pretty effective in answering the questions about him just, you know, the morning after these stories had surfaced.
Yeah, 17 questions he took, Matt, and this is an indication perhaps of President Trump interacting with the press. We have seen him on Twitter go after different reports. This was confronting these things head on in person.
Yeah, and he likes to do this. I mean, you know, his last press conference was quite a long time ago, and he broke a lot of news in that press conference, and I think some of his new handlers at the campaign said, hey, we have to stop this for a while. But if it was up to Donald Trump, I think he would take his, I hate to say enemies in the press, but those who push him in the press head on. He likes to take them on and give his answer. By the way, he was incredibly effective in knocking down this, what I think really is a really outrageous story that came out of BuzzFeed. And I also think he was particularly effective in knocking back this, somehow Russia's, you know, got the goods on him, or somehow they financed his business career. I think he knocked back those answers very effectively, and I agree with James. He made a lot of news, and he is recasting what a presidential news conference is.
Yeah, and just to be clear, senior Trump transition advisor telling Fox Tonight that he wasn't given this two-page document. That was the original CNN report. They're telling us that that is not accurate either, that it was kind of an aside mention. I want to play a soundbite about the split in the finances and how that is going to play.
I could actually run my business and run government at the same time. I don't like the way that looks, but I would be able to do that. These papers are all just a piece of the many, many companies that are being put into trust to be run by my two sons, and I hope at the end of 8 years I'll come back and I'll say, oh, you did a good job. Otherwise, if they do a bad job, I'll say, you're fired.
His sons, James, running the company, but he's saying he's essentially pulling himself out. That's likely not going to satisfy all the critics about these ties in Washington.
If you're one of the Trump sons, that was probably a daunting moment to be acquainted with the idea that you could be fired as a son from your father. Not from the business. You're fired as my son. Look, there are, and we've seen them in this town. Some of them have been dining out on the purported Trump conflicts of interest story for 3 months now, professional givers of ethics flack, and I doubt those people would have been satisfied by anything short of some kind of corporate Harry Carey to the Trump organization. But I think by most objective standards and by the standards of the people, this will look like he went pretty far along the way to do everything he needs to do, in fact, to avoid even the appearance of conflict of interest.
Yeah, Susan, I mean, the lawyer comes out, he steps aside, she lays out exactly what's going to happen. Any money that goes to any of the properties that he will still own, he's going to donate, he says, to the federal treasury. What about the appearances and the practicality of this?
Well, I think James is right that he took some steps that, and probably at some cost to himself, and maybe some pain to himself with this business empire that he has helped build. But he didn't. Maybe it's not possible to deal with the appearance of conflict of interest that are likely to follow as his sons run this empire, which is, of course, called Trump. And it's not going to be a surprise to anybody who has dealings with the Trump sons that their father is the president of the United States. I think this is going to be a continuing story. But, you know, one point that Donald Trump made today was that when the question was about why don't you release your tax returns, he said the only people who care about that are reporters. Voters don't care about that. If that's the case, then even if there are questions about the appearance of conflict of interest, maybe it doesn't hurt him, at least with the people who are behind him right now.
And yet, Matt, Democrats on the Hill will likely continue to bring that up as a big problem. Is this going to somehow hinder his ability to make deals or get along with them to get things across the finish line?
Yeah, look, I think that everything he decides when he doesn't follow the normal order of things, it has to withstand public scrutiny. So along the lines of the taxes, you know, the American people have to think that, you know, he's not doing anything improper. When it comes to his how he handles his business empire, you know, what I'm just shocked at is this Obama head of the Office of Government Ethics just taking Trump on directly, saying that this is not a real plan. I listened to that press conference. We all did. It is a serious way to approach what we haven't seen before, which is a multi-billionaire becoming the president of the United States with these marquee assets that you really can't liquidate and you really can't sell. It seemed like a common sense plan, but if the American voter and the American people